There is a particular kind of darkness that exists, not in violence that we typically associate with crime, but in calculation. Patience, in the cold, deliberate decision to look into the eyes of the people who love you most, the people who would die for you, and choose consciously and completely destroy them with a lie. A lie so enormous, so carefully constructed, so breathtakingly cruel that it would take years before anyone even began to understand the full depth of what had been done to them. This is the story of a man who died. This is the story of a man who stood in the shadows and watched his own sons weep over his empty grave, who listened to his family break apart with grief, who sat alive, breathing, completely intact, while the people who loved him most were consumed by a loss that was never real. And what makes this story truly disturbing, what elevates it beyond ordinary deception into something that psychologists still struggle to fully explain, is that he did it for money. Stay with me, because this story is going to make you question something fundamental about the human capacity for self-deception and about the devastating price that other people pay for it. On the morning of March 21st, 2002, a man paddled a canoe into the cold gray waters off the northeast coast of England. His name was John Darwin. He was 51 years old, a former prison officer, a husband, a father of 2 sons who loved him completely and without reservation. He paddled out into those waters, and he never came back. Coast Guard teams searched for days. His canoe was found damaged and empty, drifting in the water. There was no body, no sign of survival, nothing to suggest that John Darwin had gone anywhere other than to the bottom of the cold North Sea. His wife and received the news the way any wife would, with devastation, with grief so complete and so consuming that people who knew her said she was never quite the same again. His sons Mark and Anthony lost their father on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. They grieved him, buried him, tried to rebuild their lives around an absence that felt impossible to fill. Except, John Darwin was not dead. He was alive, and he was closer than any of them could possibly have imagined. What happened over the next 5 years in the spaces between grief and reality, between love and betrayal, between the life his family thought they were living and the truth that was hiding just behind the walls of their own home, is one of the most psychologically disturbing stories ever documented. And it starts, as the most devastating stories always do, not with a monster, but with a man who was simply desperately afraid of losing everything he had. To understand what John Darwin did, you first have to understand who John Darwin was before he did it. He was not a violent man, not a cruel man by any obvious measure. He was ordinary in the particular way that makes a person invisible, the kind of man you would pass in a supermarket without a second glance. Medium height, unremarkable appearance, the kind of face that blends into the background of any room. He had worked for years as a prison officer, a job that required a certain psychological toughness, a certain ability to maintain composure under pressure. He understood rules. He understood systems. He understood, perhaps better than most, what happened to people when those systems closed in around them. And by the early 2000s, the systems were closing in around John Darwin with terrifying speed. Debt. The kind of debt that starts small, a missed payment here, a bad investment there, and then compounds into something that feels completely inescapable. John had made a series of financial decisions that had gone catastrophically wrong. Properties purchased at the wrong time. Loans that had spiraled beyond his ability to manage. He was drowning, not in the North Sea, but in numbers, in letters from banks, in the particular, suffocating panic of a man who can see no way out of a situation that is getting worse every single day. He lay awake at night running calculations that never added up. He watched his wife, and who trusted him completely, who believed in him completely, and felt something that psychologists who later studied his case described as catastrophic shame, the shame of a man who believed he had failed at the most fundamental responsibility he had, providing for his family. And it was in that place, in those sleepless nights full of numbers and shame and desperation, that John Darwin began to think the unthinkable. What if he simply disappeared? What if the debt disappeared with him? What if death, or the appearance of death, was the only exit from a situation that had become completely unbearable? It started as a thought, the way the most dangerous ideas always do, quietly, in the dark, when nobody is watching. The plan that John Darwin eventually constructed was both breathtakingly simple and almost incomprehensibly cruel. He would fake his own death. The life insurance policy he carried would pay out to and enough to clear the debts that had been consuming them both, and would be free. The financial nightmare would be over, and John Darwin would simply cease to exist, at least on paper. In reality, he had something else in mind entirely. He had identified a bedsit, a small rented room in the house directly next door to the family home where and their son still lived. Let that settle for a moment. Not across town, not in another city, not in another country. Next door, separated from his grieving family by nothing more than a single shared wall. He would live there, quietly, invisibly, slipping between the two properties through a connecting door that he had carefully arranged to have access to. He would be, in every sense that mattered, a ghost, present enough to maintain some shadow of a life, absent enough that nobody would ever know. The psychological audacity of this plan, the sheer breathtaking coldness of its construction, is something that forensic psychologists who later studied the case returned to again and again, because this was not impulsive. This was not the decision of a man in a moment of crisis who acted without thinking. This was planned, carefully, over weeks and months, with a level of detachment from the emotional reality of what he was about to do to his family that investigators found genuinely disturbing. He had thought about the insurance money. He had thought about the bedsit next door. He had thought about the canoe and the cold water and the damaged hull that would be found drifting. What is less clear what psychologists believe he may have actively avoided thinking about was his sons, Mark and Anthony, the two young men who called him Dad, who would stand at his grave and weep for a father who was listening from the other side of a wall. On that gray March morning in 2002, John Darwin carried out his plan with the same cold precision he had used to construct it. He took his canoe out into the water. He staged the scene carefully, and then he disappeared. The Coast Guard search that followed was genuine. The rescuers who combed those cold waters looking for any sign of John Darwin were doing their jobs with complete sincerity, because they had no reason to believe they were searching for a man who was already safely on dry land and received the news. And here is where the story becomes truly complicated. Because in Darwin, the grieving widow who appeared on television, who accepted the condolences of friends and neighbors and colleagues, who watched her sons fall apart with grief, and Darwin knew she had been part of the plan from the beginning. This detail, this single devastating detail, transformed the story from a tale of one man's deception into something far more psychologically complex. Two people had looked at their sons, had looked at the young men they had raised and loved and watched grow up, and had chosen together, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were doing, to let them grieve, to let them believe their father was dead, to let them carry that loss, that heavy, life-altering, identity-shaping loss for years. While John Darwin lived next door, while and visited him through the connecting door between the two properties, while their sons, just meters away, tried to rebuild lives that had been broken by a lie their own parents had constructed. For 5 years, John Darwin lived as a ghost. He developed an extraordinary routine for invisibility. He moved at times when neighbors were unlikely to see him. He kept the bedsit dark and quiet. He communicated with and through the connecting door, a secret passage between the world of the living and the world of the supposedly dead, and maintained the performance of widowhood with remarkable consistency. She grieved publicly. She sold the family home as any widow managing finances alone might do. She interacted with her sons with the particular careful tenderness of a mother who was watching her children carry a pain she knew was built on nothing. And somehow for 5 years the wall held. Nobody looked too closely. Nobody asked the questions that might have unraveled everything. John Darwin existed in a space that has almost no psychological precedent. A man fully alive, fully conscious, fully aware of the grief surrounding him, choosing every single day to remain invisible. Forensic psychologists who later studied his case described what he experienced during those 5 years as a form of extreme dissociation, a splitting of the self into two irreconcilable versions. The John Darwin who was dead, who existed in the memories and grief of his sons, in the official records, in the insurance documents, and the John Darwin who was alive, who ate and slept and breathed and existed in a small dark room next to the family he had abandoned. They described him as someone who had constructed an internal architecture that kept these two versions completely separate, who had perhaps necessarily stopped fully feeling the reality of what he was doing, because to fully feel it would have been unbearable, even for him. 5 years is a long time to maintain a lie of that magnitude, and eventually, as lies always do, it began to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the particular quiet inevitability of a structure that has been under pressure for too long. John and had begun making plans to start a new life together abroad. They had been researching properties, making financial arrangements, preparing to step out of the shadow existence. They had been maintaining and into something that felt finally like freedom. And in 2007, a photograph surfaced. A single photograph taken during one of their planning trips abroad. John Darwin, the man who had been officially dead for 5 years, smiling in a photograph that ended up accessible online. It was spotted, identified, and reported. The investigation that followed moved with extraordinary speed. John Darwin walked into a London police station in December 2007, claiming to have lost his memory, claiming he didn't know who he was or where he had been. The claim lasted approximately as long as it took investigators to pull the photograph. Within days, the full story began to emerge. The canoe, the bedsit, the connecting door, the 5 years of living next door to his grieving sons, the insurance money, and his involvement from the very beginning. The world watched in stunned silence as the details emerged one by one. But nobody was more stunned, nobody was more devastated than Mark and Anthony Darwin, the two sons who had spent 5 years grieving a father who had been listening through the wall. Mark and Anthony Darwin learned the truth the way the rest of the world did, through the news. Let that settle. They did not receive a phone call from their father, did not sit down with their parents for a painful conversation, did not get the dignity of a private revelation before the public one. They found out along with millions of strangers that their father was alive, had been alive for 5 years, had been living next door. The psychological impact of that discovery is almost impossible to overstate. Grief, real grief, the kind that reshapes a person's identity and rewires their relationship with the world, had been their reality for 5 years. They had done the work of loss, had rebuilt themselves around an absence, had created new versions of themselves that incorporated the fact of their father's death as a fundamental truth. And then that truth was simply removed, replaced not with relief, not with joy, not with the uncomplicated happiness of learning that someone you love is still alive, but with something far more complicated and far more painful. Betrayal. The realization that their grief, every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of missing their father had been manufactured, had been a performance in a play they didn't know they were acting in. Psychologists who worked with the family afterward described the specific trauma experienced by Mark and Anthony as having almost no clinical precedent, because there is no established framework for processing the simultaneous experience of relief that someone is alive and devastation at what they chose to do. There is no language for loving someone and discovering they were capable of this. There is no roadmap for forgiving or not forgiving something this enormous. Mark and Anthony Darwin made their positions clear publicly. They cut off contact with both parents, completely, finally, without ambiguity. The family that John Darwin had tried to protect from financial ruin, the family whose future he had claimed to be thinking about when he constructed his elaborate lie, was gone, destroyed not by debt, but by the man who said he loved them. John Darwin pleaded guilty to fraud and deception charges. He was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. And Darwin, who had maintained the lie for 5 years, who had watched her sons grieve, who had managed the insurance money and the property sales and the planning for their new life abroad, was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months. She received a longer sentence than her husband. The judge made clear that her sustained deception, her willingness to watch her own children suffer, was considered an aggravating factor that warranted the additional time. Both were released early on good behavior. Both rebuilt lives separately. Their marriage did not survive the full exposure of what they had done together. John Darwin eventually spoke publicly about the experience. He described the 5 years in the bedsit as psychologically suffocating. said he had underestimated what it would feel like to exist without identity, without acknowledgement, without the basic human experience of being seen by the people who knew you. He had wanted to escape debt. Instead, he had created a prison far more confining than any financial situation could ever have been. A prison of his own construction, with walls made of lies. And the most devastating thing about this entire story, the thing that should make every single person watching this pause and reflect, is that it never had to happen. The debt was manageable. The financial crisis was survivable. Thousands of people face situations just as desperate every single year and find ways through that. Don't require destroying the people who love them. All John Darwin had to do was tell the truth. That is all. Just the truth. Instead, he chose the canoe, the bedsit, the connecting door, the 5 years of silence while his sons grieved on the other side of a wall. And in doing so, he lost the only things that actually mattered. Not the money, not the properties, his sons. If this story made you think, if it made you look at the people you love and feel grateful for the simple, uncomplicated truth of their presence in your life, share it with someone today, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply remind each other what actually matters. I will see you in the next one.